Knowledge Stream is made possible by a generous gift provided by the Appold Family Charitable Fund.
Thank you. It is good to be here. I have to admit that I'm a huge nerd. And so talking about science really early on a Saturday morning is actually something that really appeals to me. And in putting together a presentation, I actually only really put together a PowerPoint full of pictures to guide me through stuff without going too deep, dark into the black hole of chocolate, which we often call it. So pastry chefs are oftentimes sucked into the black hole of chocolate, and they never come back out because there's something that you just, once you learn one thing, it leads to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, and that's what we're going to try to avoid for all of this. But if you want to go there afterwards, just know I'm going to give you our email, and you can email me, and we can nerd out by email about all kinds of things. So we'll touch on a lot of different scientific elements, but the process of chocolate in and of itself involves, it's just a long, intricate process. So for the purposes of this, we're going to try to touch each and every one of them, but give you guys a good idea and a quote, for lack of a better word, a quote unquote taste, for lack of a better word, of each and every little tiny bit of it. Sometimes even literally we'll let you taste what we're talking about. So you know who I am. My name's Alex Clark, and I grew up in Michigan. I grew up just outside of Detroit. I wanted to be an ice cream shop owner from the time I was 14 and got a job at the ice cream shop down the street. And I absolutely just fell in love with it. It was the only thing I ever wanted to do. My parents asked me, what do you want to do after you finish high school? And the only answer I could come up with was, well, I just want to keep making ice cream. And they were like, okay, sounds good. And I just remember my mom asking, are there competitions? How do we get involved in this? What do you do? And so of course we landed at Michigan State, and they have an amazing dairy science school. And what happened when we went is the power actually went out, and so they were giving away ice cream. And so I show up for a campus tour to think about potentially going there and studying ice cream, and they hand me an ice cream this big, and the factory is shut down, so they're like, as long as you're eating that, you want to come in and see what's going on? We've got some time. And next thing you know, I'm literally in a factory eating ice cream. I'm like, this is phenomenal. This is what I want to do. This is absolutely it. I'm 100% sure. I ended up going on an exchange program that completely changed the trajectory of that. I studied in Norway. Most of my family's adopted, but we are Norwegian by claim, and or by culture at least. So I studied in Norway, and I ended up doing an exchange with a private school, and I had never attended a private school. I had no idea how different that experience would be. And friends of mine were taking weekend trips to Portugal, and I was taking weekend trips to the free sculpture garden. And it was just something that they had taken notice of and started being very welcoming on these amazing adventures all over Europe and Scandinavia. And I, of course, wanted to go, but I felt really guilty I didn't want to take advantage. And so my idea was that I would search for where the best chocolate shop was in every single city that we went to. And what I discovered is probably the best thing that you can take away from this whole talk, which is the best piece of chocolate in any city, anywhere in the world, costs less than $5. And that's pretty cool, because if you go and you walk into the best restaurant in Detroit, and you walk in and you say, hey, instead of sitting down and paying $75 for my entree, would it be all right if I just have one bite and I'll pay you $3? It doesn't work that way, you know? But in chocolate, it's just inherently that way. So you can go to a place and you can learn a lot about what's going on in their culinary community just by going to the best chocolate shop there. So by the time I actually got to a chocolate shop that was doing chocolate that was really, really smart, where you could tell that they were trying to create an experience for the person who was eating that piece of chocolate, it blew my mind. I had a bunch of friends there. I was taking them out for a piece of chocolate to say thank you. I had no idea that this one would be so much different than all of the other ones that we had gone to. And I got in line and I got my raspberry bonbon. And then I put it in my mouth and I just got back in line. and I got a rhubarb one, and by the time I walked out, I was holding onto my friend's elbows, and I'm just like sobbing outside of the chocolate store, and I'm like, it's not ice cream, it's chocolate, this isn't the way it goes. Complete emotional breakdown, and chocolate has been the only thing I have studied since then. I went back to the food science school. I still do have a degree in dairy science from Michigan State, as well as hospitality business, which I tacked on, because the first questions you start asking are things like, well, if I'm going to open a chocolate shop, what kind of chocolate am I going to buy? And then zoom, you're sucked into the black hole because it starts to bring up issues like child slave labor and forced servitude and things that as a human, I'm just not really comfortable with. So it led me into asking every single food science professor I could find at Michigan State, do you know anyone who knows anything about chocolate? And it took me into a research program at Michigan State where I was working with USAID on a project that was sourcing chocolate from Sierra Leone. And then we were trying to figure out how to match it up with fabric stores in the United States. Sort of a cool project. I'm like 21 years old and I'm sitting across from these women who are like, so anyway, Civil War, but our husband stopped farming the cacao trees, and so now we farm the cacao trees, and then we use the money, and then we buy fabric, and now we're a fashion mecca. And I just remember sitting in that conversation being like, I am so underqualified and so into this job. Like, it was mind-blowing, and it opened up this world where I realized that I could actually make a difference and that I could actually learn more. And then one day my boss walked into my office and said, Alex, good news, bad news. And I said, okay, bad news first. And the bad news was my job didn't exist anymore. And the good news was it existed in New Zealand, but I had to do my master's. And so I moved and I went to New Zealand and I kept studying chocolate and I got deeper and deeper into this black hole, and I had to kind of suck myself back out. Like, remember how I just wanted to open a chocolate shop? And so I started writing letters to people, and I would just say, hey, I will do anything. I will clean your floors. I just want to learn how to make chocolate. Like, whatever job I can get. And the reality is most people never wrote back. My favorite chocolatier in the whole world, like who I am obsessed with, never wrote back. And I told him that when I met him too. And it just never ended up, I don't know, most people never wrote back, but I will always value the people who did. Because chocolate's such an antiquated industry, and there is a lot of old but very good knowledge that's still out there that's being somewhat forgotten today. And Bon 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 is very much walking a fine line in between honoring that knowledge, but also bringing in a whole bunch of food science that's happened in the last 150 years that makes our caramel, I think, or I would hope, a little bit better than a caramel that was your grandma's recipe from 150 years ago. So it's a little bit about how I ended up to chocolate. That's a lot of it about how I ended up to chocolate. What you do need to know is this is my dog Lou, and she is the love of my life and our shop dog, and that's her favorite store of ours in Midtown. And I realized already that I had put 2 pictures of Lou, so I put a picture of my husband too in front of our Hamtramck shop. We have 3 stores. I can switch on to, we have 3 stores, all within the city of Detroit. Like they were saying, Hamtramck is a city within the city of Detroit. That's our manufactory. We manufacture everything all in one spot. And then we have 1 retail store that's right downtown in the business district, and 1 retail store that's sort of in the shopping district that's cuter and fancier. Bon 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 makes bonbons, and bonbons have no clear definition. So in the chocolate world, bonbons are confusing, and we use that confusion to our advantage to be more creative. So a truffle is round, and it should look like the fungus, and it should be made of ganache, and it has a lot of rules. So if you're seeing a truffle and it's filled with peanut butter and jelly and caramel, and it's decorated with all kinds of stuff, there are chocolatiers that have a problem with that because technically it's outside of the definition of a truffle, and so it no longer counts. Bon Bon is more all-inclusive, and one of my favorite things about bonbons is that we source our chocolate from Ecuador and Colombia, and we're there pretty often, at least once a year. And when we go and you ask these cacao farmers who are actually farming our cacao for our chocolate, what is a bonbon, they will tell you it's a hard candy or a sucker. So even the people who are making the chocolate for what we're calling a bonbon don't consider what we're making a bonbon, which I think is fantastic because it really gives us total creative license in order to be able to stretch some rules that already exist. The chocolates that we make are very much a reaction to the work that I was doing working for other people. Being from Detroit, and I imagine being from Ohio, as many of you I assume are, things being made in Detroit is really important culturally to us. So like when I was in high school, I wasn't allowed to bring home a guy who drove a foreign car. And I just knew it. It was allowed. It was an unspoken rule, right? And so working in all of these chocolate factories, I was realizing that they're just shipping in all of their boxes, all of their packaging from China. And I just kept thinking, I'm like, I can't do this. Like, this is not, I can't. There's no way that I could ever be ordering in so much stuff, not only for the carbon footprint of shipping something that's so inexpensive that far, but I knew I had to come up with a design that I could source locally. And I also wanted it to be rather chocolate-centric. But like I was saying, that chocolate is such an antiquated product. There's straight up this saying, like, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that, to me, is a design problem, right? You're like, just label it. We'll put it in a box and we'll put the name on it, and then you know what you're getting. So, as I'm working for all of these other people, and I'm just developing all of these ideas, and to be totally honest, like, yeah, when you see them and when you know that I have a really successful company that's absolutely blown up, it's one thing, and it sounds like one thing, but at the time, it was one of those things where maybe even mentioning some of those things was like not okay. Very often you have these companies that are, they're trying so hard to connect with this image of their roots of something that happened 150 years ago, and meanwhile what's happening right now is actually way cooler. For example, you see so many advertisements. My favorite advertisement is for a really big chocolate company, and it's this guy, and he's like super tan, but like fake tan, you know. And he has his hand up like this, and there's a chocolate truffle like floating above his hand, and he has like a spatula above it that I've never seen, and I've worked in chocolate half my life, and he's like doing something that I don't know, I've never seen done before. And he has this big floppy hat on, and I've worn a lot of different floppy hats in a lot of different kitchens, and I've never seen this floppy hat before. And they're trying so hard, and meanwhile at that same company, as with most chocolate that's made in the United States, that chocolate's actually being made in New Jersey by a whole bunch of women that look like me, or older, with arms like this big, that are totally rad, that are like single moms. And you're like, why don't we just tell the real story about like these super cool people that are making this really delicious chocolate, instead of trying to make it something else? So Bon 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 came out of this idea and these questions of saying, like, why do we have to make it about all of this other stuff, and why do we have to have this fancy packaging from far away? And I'm so sick of tying those fancy bows. We have a rubber band with a bow on it, so when somebody asks for a bow at Bon Bon Bon, they can have it. But it was very much a reaction to all of these things, and our biggest commitment is just to make the goodest chocolate possible. So bon means good, and the idea is that it's good goodies, or good, which is three goods, which is très bon, which is very good in French, if any of you speak Spanish or French. So the idea is that it's just the most sincerely good chocolate possible, and that's what we always commit to, is anything that we do the goodest that we can do with the resources we have at that time. In the beginning, those resources were $32,000 that I had from a car accident that I was in on the way home from a chocolate conference that I was at for work. And I took that money and I made an Excel spreadsheet, and I made a list of all of the things that I knew I needed in order to start a chocolate shop, and I was able to pay for about a third of them. So when we opened, we weren't really ready to open, and I knew it, but I just couldn't take it anymore. So I knew we couldn't open for retail, and it wasn't exactly the chocolate store of my dreams, but it was mine, and it was great. And when I met my landlord there, it was across the street from my roommate's grandpa's house. It's in the back room of a Coney Island. Do you guys have Coney Islands here? Do you know what that is? Okay. So it's in the back room of a diner, and it's just like, it had these like stained drop ceilings, and somebody had painted all of these things on the wall, but like not taped it off very nice, and the counters were fuchsia. And my landlord walked me in and like was looking at the water heater, and I'm pretending like I know anything about water heaters, and I don't. And we walk out, and he locks the door, and he hands me the key, and we walk to our cars, and he drives away, and I drive around the block, and then go back to the parking lot and park, and go back in and open the door, and I locked it behind me, and I closed the shades, and I was just like, this is the biggest mistake I've ever made in my entire life. This is it. here I am. And since then, from the moment that we started, I've completely underestimated what exactly it was that trying to make the goodest chocolate possible has created. So where we're at now, we've been able to, we started by just making chocolate and shipping it all over the world. We started with hotel amenities and a website, and we weren't necessarily open to the public, but people would stop in because we live in a great neighborhood, and they would just be like, hey, what are you doing? And we're like, we're making chocolate. And they'd go, well, can we buy some? And we're like, oh, well, you can't, we aren't really set up for that, but like you can just have some. You can take some with you if you want. And so we'd package up chocolate and they'd take it to like their mom's birthday, and there'd be 12 people there, and inevitably 2 of them would come in the next week. And they would come in and they'd be like, hey, we had this chocolate at this lady's birthday, and we'd like to buy some. We're heading to Texas, and we just want to bring something from Detroit with us. And we're like, oh, so we aren't actually set up for that. But you can just have some. And this became such a problem that we put a sign on the door that just said, like, we are not open. You can peek through the windows. You can look at us on Instagram or social media. You can check out our website. But we are not open. And the last line just said, knock again if you have champagne. Because when you're starting a small business, I had $7 to my name between me and the business in the first 2 months. And it was like, I love great champagne. I really love it. And I also love making chocolate. And if you're gonna come in and interrupt me from making chocolate, which I'm happy to give to you, you better bring something that I also love. So that got out of control to the point where we were actually sustaining the temperature of our refrigerator with champagne. So we were keeping the bottles in there because if we had a lot of bottles that stayed cold in there, it helped the refrigerator to stay cold all the time, which is important for the tempering process, which you'll learn about. Next thing you know, our neighbor comes in and he's like, Alex, I can't watch this anymore. You need to open up just 1 day a week. You have to do it. And so we opened up, and the first day of retail, I had 12 friends there, 9 of which had worked in restaurants or chocolate shops before, and they made some of the weirdest chocolate I've ever seen in my life, but we paid our rent for the year. So from that time until I think maybe a year and a half ago, I have no idea what happened. Once we were 4 months old, we were in Martha Stewart magazine, we were in Taste Made, we were everywhere. It just kind of went crazy. Next thing you know, we had a space downtown. We had a brand new website. We had all these people coming at us, and it was a totally wild ride. And the only thing that carried our company through the whole thing is how much I love not only the chocolate, and how much my employees and our team love the chocolate and love the process and believe in our purchasing and why we're doing what we're doing in terms of sustainability, decreasing waste, and purchasing responsibly. But it's also all of the people that we get to work with. We have this like incredibly interesting and diverse staff, and getting to be a very creative company. In Hamtramck is only 2 square miles, but it's actually the most diverse city in the state. Everyone's from everywhere. So in Michigan, which has the 2nd most diverse agricultural economy in the country next to California, it's like being a chocolatier with all of the crayons. You know, like you get to paint in every single color. Everything is an option. And so that makes it absolutely the most fun work experience that I could ever imagine. So with no further ado, understanding chocolate, first we have to understand where it comes from. So chocolate can be grown anywhere north or south of the equator within 20 degrees. We source, like I said, from Ecuador and from Colombia, but you can also source from Africa, you can source from Asia. There's more and more coming up from kind of like boutique sources. Places like Hawaii are growing chocolate. There is one tree in Ann Arbor that I know of that actually will create a pod or 2. It's inside of their botanical gardens. It grows, that's one of their flowers. That's actually me holding it. They kind of look like, this one's a little wilted, but they sort of look like a little baby orchid when they're open. They grow right on the trees. So I think here we're more familiar with like apple trees or peach trees, where like the tree branches out like this, and then there's the fruit kind of at the ends. And cacao trees don't do that at all. They just sort of grow from everywhere. So you can be looking at a tree, like the trees in the background there, and these pods, which is what they're growing, they kind of look like big footballs filled with cacao beans. And they're like this big, but they'll be growing like right off of the trunk, or they'll be growing like right off of the arm, and in big bunches of them, and totally unpredictably. they look like they're prehistoric or something. Like they look like they're from outer space. They just don't, it doesn't look like any other tree you've ever seen. And you take it and you use a machete in order to remove the pod from the tree. And you use a machete on purpose, because if you actually just pull the pod the way that you would pull an apple, you can introduce the trees to a variety of diseases. Diseases are the most, one of the biggest concerns that we have as a larger industry for cacao. The two biggest kind of like current event things that are happening are diseases that are threatening especially heritage varietals of cacao, kind of like the fine flavor chocolates, that don't really infect the genetically modified stuff that doesn't really taste like anything too delicious. But they will, and it's threatening our entire chocolate supply, as well as, of course, climate change. But another one is actually the heavy metals that are in the earth in the Amazonian region following some volcanic activity. Cadmium can actually be leached up through the roots of the cacao tree and make it into the chocolate. So we have a huge issue with some of our suppliers, and it's actually hit us. Already Venezuela being in political unrest means you really can't get cacao out of Venezuela, and now this hitting the Amazon means it's really, really difficult for some people that have been working very hard to work on especially some biodiversity and ecology issues on their farms to even be able to sell their product now. It's pretty much all waste. Some other plants will not soak up the cadmium and have it end up in the final product. But for some reason, cacao absolutely will. And so cadmium testing has become something that is just commonplace and expected from people like us who are buying chocolate from a manufacturer. But it's caused a huge just challenge for people to come up with alternative products in order to be able to provide a living for the people that we're so used to working with. So when you see this is like the cacao fruit. So you have the pod on the outside, and on the inside, in one of these, there's usually about 40 beans. The beans are coated with a fruit, kind of like if you had a really big pomegranate seed, where like there's something crunchy in the middle, but there's a lot of fruit on the outside. And the fruit, I swear to you that the person who invented the green Jolly Rancher invented it from this fruit. It tastes just like a green Jolly Rancher. So the fruit on the outside is actually what they use. The sugars in the fruit are what helps to ferment the beans. The fermentation, of course, is super, super important for flavor development. But you can see, so here the fermentation starts as soon as that pod is open. As soon as it's exposed to air, it's going to start fermenting. Some people are actually fermenting it on their farms, so they'll use like big banana leaves and they'll wrap it up. It's a not so controlled fermentation, and what people like me who are buying fine flavor cacao and paying a really high price are looking for is we want a controlled fermentation. So we want to work through the co-op and have the co-op fermenting. That said, even that fermentation process is not super, super controlled, but we're just making sure that there's no like wild yeasts going on that are going to make all of our beans taste like bananas, which has happened before. I used to work at a bean to bar company, and we opened up a huge shipment. We were so excited to get it. And we opened up this bag of beans, and it smelled normal, it looked normal, everything looked really good, and it tasted just like bananas, like runts, like fake banana flavor. And there was nothing we could do about it. And we had ordered all of it. It was exactly what we ordered. It was exactly correct. Why did it taste like that? And it's because there's still a lot of X factors in this part of the process in terms of what's actually developing the flavor. So a lot of times this is how it's making it to the co-op. And I always use this poor guy, I have no idea who he is. This is just like so common, and I talk about this all the time because I think a lot of times, and in a lot of other countries there is like plantation cacao growing, but where we source from, cacao is so happy there that it just grows everywhere. So very often bringing in the cacao beans is something that like your wife is telling you to do, like could you please just go harvest that cacao and bring them into the co-op. So this guy is driving this like beautiful car and then bringing them in just in his little like 5-gallon buckets. And the fermentation has already started in that guy's trunk. Like it's already happening. So all of these beans are coming in and they're heavy because they're just full of water. And then they go into over here, which is the fermentation space. So these will collect they'll take like a whole day's worth. Everything will come in for the day. And then it goes into the top box in these fermentation boxes. And what happens here is all of these boxes could be full at the same time, but they're just following a different time, and each day they will go down another step. So it's just going from one to the next to the next. One of the biggest issues here, and it's something I'm really interested in, is that as the fruit from these fermenting beans starts coming out, it's super acidic. And so one of the problems that we have in terms of this part of the process is that the acidic juice will come out, and most of the facilities like this have concrete floors, and the acidity will actually eat away at the concrete floor to the point where there is an amount of time where we have wasted beans because they have to replace the floors. But there's a lot of sugar in that juice. And so the idea is that potentially you could be making alcohol out of the remaining juice that's coming out of the cacao, and you have a secondary byproduct. Is that a revolutionary idea? No. Everybody's already making moonshine out of it also. It's just if there was a commercial enterprise doing this that could keep up with the cacao bean production and could keep up with the demand for chocolate, then we could really do something with it, and we could resolve this problem and help to make sure that our supply of cacao is coming more regularly. So it goes from the top one to the next one to the next one to the next one. If you stick your hand into this pot of beans, you can feel the warmth. Like it's not hot, but it is distinctly warm. Like there is some active fermentation going on. And this entire thing is happening within about 4 days. We'll get emptied out, and it's happening separate from each other, at least in our case. So when one farm brings in its beans, they're tracking which farm's beans are where, so that let's say there is a flavor combination that really suits us, that's something that we really like, we can actually do that. Or if there is a problem, we can actually trace it back and figure out what it is before it ends up going and impacting a whole bunch of other beans. So once the flavor has been developed and they have been fermented for days, and there's a lot of cool experiments here too of people actively trying to introduce like interesting yeast, like introducing champagne yeast to a chocolate fermentation process. I've tried some of the chocolate, and it actually, you can't tell. You know, it's not anything that's like majorly different than anything else that's kind of going on. Oh, and I included a picture of fruit flies because it is just frankly shocking how many fruit flies are on the chocolate. And there are like stats of how much bug parts are allowed to be in chocolate. It's very minuscule, but it is just simply a reality that if you're eating chocolate, there are definitely, there's at least one fruit fly that has been in there. It's still delicious, I still eat it. So once they've all been fermented, a lot of the water has already been removed from the fermentation process. Then it goes into drying. And these are two separate drying facilities. They're both in Ecuador. Just one is much smaller than the other. So you can see in the one on the left, it's all just one big batch of beans. This is a smaller facility that can kind of take everything from the area and still be able to track issues. Whereas here, each pile of beans has a piece of paper with it. And this provides an amount of traceability. This traceability is really, really important for somebody like me because I want the receipt that you paid the farmer so I know how much that person made. We operate totally outside of the chocolate commodity market. And it's very easy to tell me that you paid a lot for those beans and that you're treating your farmers fairly. And it's another thing to ask for receipts. And especially as a woman, it's very important for me to see that the receipts are exactly the same for a woman as they are for a man, because that can be a common issue in these areas as well. So here you can see there's a little piece of paper in a plastic bag in every single one of these, and that's just tracking which farm this came from and on which date. So this is where inventory is basically coming in order to be able to roast and grind these beans. Here, they're sitting in the sun and they're drying, and there's a couple different systems that people will use. They can use a system like this, where this whole sheet will actually roll out and they'll just use it in the sun, and when they start to feel rain coming, everybody runs outside at the co-op, pushes everything back in. To give you an idea of the value of these beans, at this facility here, it was robbed and raided, and it was worth over $2 million. And that's a small facility. But people were able to take it and sell it for the quality of those beans and get away with it, which is really scary. So this one here is actually just set up to always be under, but it has some great like wind flow ventilation to just dry them out. So they're drying there, and being dry is really, really important because, like I said, controlled fermentation process. Once you can stop the moisture, then you can stop the fermentation. So this kind of contraption here that you're looking at here is for a quality test for the beans. So you take the beans and you just kind of take a random sampling and you plop them into this thing, you fold it over, and then you slice it in half. And that lets you see the inside. People who are experts at looking at this can tell you, they'll say like out of this, 30% is no good, which is still usable. People will still grind that. It's just a matter of who's willing to deal with that quality level. So they'll slice them in half, look at the beans, see what's going on, see what the quality is, make sure that they were actually harvested at their peak ripeness, and not because sometimes people will harvest early just because they need some money. And so this is really your standard of acceptance. Like, are you willing to accept these beans? Are they quality beans? And part of the reason why is sometimes they just ship as beans. So if we were actually making chocolate here, like if we were bean to bar here, this would be an extraordinarily important measure for us personally, because you are now taking a product that might be wet and then putting it onto a boat and shipping it. It still goes to New Jersey, and then getting it to Michigan. And by the time it gets to me, if it's just still a little wet, then instead of having a whole bunch of delicious chocolate, I have a whole bunch of moldy beans. And that's not ideal. So once they've been accepted by the processing facility, then you can take them and roast them. So you roast them first. They still have this sort of like skin on the outside. And of course, just like coffee, where you can have a dark roast or a medium roast or a light roast, you can have whatever you want. And it's just Maillard reactions, just like toasting anything else. And so you're toasting and toasting and toasting and developing this flavor to the extent that you want it to go to. For us, we have a very controlled flavor profile that we really like, and it's really important for a bonbon maker, and it's really different than it is for a company that's making chocolate bars. So when you're making a chocolate bar, you're trying to have this flavor that somebody can taste it, and they can taste sort of your signature on it. And they're like, I know for sure that is a Theo chocolate bar. Theo's from Seattle. You know, like that is definitely Theo chocolate because it's kind of nutty and it has this floral thing going on, and you can sort of, you're trying to create, that is the flavor you're trying to create. Versus when you're making chocolate bonbons like we do, we want something that's uniquely chocolatey and distinctly chocolatey, but that's a little bit well-rounded, because we're going to put it with blue cheese, and we're going to put it with honey, and we're going to put it with eggs, and we're going to put it with ham. You know, it's going to be with everything, and so we need something that can stand up to all of those, instead of it being something that's unique on its own. So with this, we can kind of, like, of course, we go for something that's kind of medium roasted. We don't want it to be too astringent, which can happen if you're roasting it for too long. We don't want it to be something where it's too fruit forward and like kind of zingy up front, because that doesn't necessarily go with everything. So we want it to be a little bit mild and still keep some of its fruity characteristics, but not necessarily go to the end of being super astringent and distinctly toasty. Then you can see this machine here is a winnower. What a winnower is doing, and this process is so much easier to talk through, because even if you see the inside of a lot of chocolate making machines, it makes less sense than if you just explain it. So winnowers are like if you threw something down the stairs and it just goes boop, 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 boop. And like imagine throwing an egg down the stairs, like the shell would crack rather quickly, right? So the outside shell of the cacao bean is exactly the same way. At this point, it is dry and brittle. It wants to come off. It's actually a waste product, and you'll see it used a lot. Sometimes it's used in, like, if you have a chocolate flavored tea, you'll have some of the outside skin in it. People use it for mulch. It's really expensive mulch in the United States, but very inexpensive in other places. You can use it as mulch. You can use it for a variety of other purposes. So it is still captured by a vacuum. And then the little nibs, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of cocoa nibs. It's just the beans broken up into tiny, tiny pieces. So each one of these beans, basically what it contains, it's primarily fat. So you have a fat and protein with a little bit of sugar inside of a little tiny bean that's already been roasted. And that's kind of what we're working with when we get to the next process. If you eat it on its own, have you guys ever, you know, like when you're little and you break into your mom's, like you think it's chocolate, but it's actually baking chocolate? Which is funny, Baker's is a brand, but Baker's was actually the name of the guy who made Baker's chocolate. So it's not just Baker's chocolate, it's actually Baker's chocolate. So like you go and you're like so excited because it's actually chocolate, but it doesn't taste the way you want. And that's exactly what cacao nibs taste like. Like that's just chocolate as it is. And there's a reason for that. So chocolate actually has 1,500 different chemical components in it, which is one of my favorite facts, because all the time, and especially in our stores, people come in and they'll say, oh, I heard chocolate's good for you because of this, and chocolate's bad for you because of this, and chocolate's this because of this. And our answer is yes, all of it. It's such a complicated food that it's difficult to say any of it. Does it contain caffeine? Yes. It also contains 1,499 other things. So there's a lot going on with it. To give you an idea, it is multiple times more complicated than a cup of coffee. And a cup of coffee as it is can be an experience to somebody who's never had one before. So it's also in a crystalline state, which is an interesting thing because there's not a lot of crystalline foods. And crystalline foods are always delicious. So other crystalline foods are like ice. Ice is an interesting food to eat. There's something unique about it. So is butter. And like, we can't deny that butter is something special. So crystalline structured foods are something that are already kind of unique as it is. And then you have this really chemically complex crystalline food, and it makes it even more interesting. But we have some options. So originally, chocolate was used as a drink. So technically hot chocolate came first, but not necessarily in the form that we think of it now. So in Mesoamerica, cacao was worshipped. They called it food of the gods. Like, even its scientific name is Theobroma cacao, and it just means food of the gods. And the reason, so they would have, Montezuma is like rumored before he would spend the evening with his harems to have 20 cups of cacao, and they used it as money. It was that valuable, of being like, each bean would be a certain amount of money and they would exchange it. So this was a drink, and it was a drink that was meant for people that were very high up. So when European explorers came over and discovered this, they were very interested and brought it back and said, here is this drink that is meant, for, it's sacred and it's very special. And people tried it and had probably the same reaction that we have when you accidentally break into your mom's baking chocolate, and we're like, wow, this is interesting. But thank goodness for a couple of creative people. The way that you traditionally prepare it, and we actually had this really cool experience where we were in Colombia, and we had a 100-year-old woman teach us how to make hot chocolate. She's my friend's grandma. And it was amazing to take 100 years off of a history that's only so many thousand years old, and it was already so different, but so much the same. So there it's made with, and in the past it's been made with water and corn and spices, and you grate a solid ground up block of the cacao beans into it, and then you can add other things to it. And so in explaining this, when they got back to Europe, of course it's like playing telephone, and some things like, some parts make it in there and some parts don't. And next thing you know, they're making the blocks, and they know that has to happen. And then they're grating them in, but they're kind of just sticking with like coffee service, which gets served with milk and sugar. And so you start adding milk and sugar to it, and they're going, wow, this stuff is pretty good. Like, we sort of like this. And then next thing you know, people are actually like doing the same thing, daring to kind of eat the chocolate block. And they're like, we could eat this too. So all of a sudden, people are developing and rapidly developing all of this technology to process chocolate. And each country in Europe is kind of coming up with a different way of doing it. And some of these processes still sort of remain. So there is still a category of chocolate, which you've probably never heard of, but I guarantee you've consumed, which is Dutch processed or alkalized chocolate. So they just alkalize it during the process of making it. And it's something that the Dutch people were doing for who knows why. They just assumed that it was the right thing to do. And it creates a very, very distinct flavor that gives the outside cookies and Oreo the flavor of Oreos. So if you ever have Dutch processed cacao, it basically just tastes like an Oreo to the American palate. And people were exploring with this in the United States after a long time too, and making the same mistakes that are still impacting us to this day. So for example, Hershey's was originally a caramel company, and saw some chocolate equipment at the World's Fair and was like, well, why not? I'm making these caramels, I can make some chocolate, this goes together like chocolate and caramel. Went ahead and tried to make the chocolate without really knowing what they were doing, which as an entrepreneur you do 10 times a day, and is trying to figure out this process, and realizes like, okay, I think I can do this. I think I can make some milk chocolate. And then in the process, soured the milk the slightest bit by not doing it the way that the manufacturer had recommended, but became very popular because of great marketing to the United States. And so to this day, chocolate that is made for the American market will have a slight tang to it that European chocolate does not have. So when you eat chocolate in Europe and it tastes a little extra creamy, it's not actually always because there's a higher milk content to it. It's because we all grew up, or our parents' parents grew up on Hershey's, and Hershey's has that slight tang, and people have continued to mimic, and it's just become our cultural thing within the United States. So the process has been done 1,000 different ways. People are trying to figure out, like at the time, people were trying to figure out kind of how do we do this way before Hershey's. And they start adding the sugar, and they start adding the cream, and they start adding it in all different combinations, figuring out kind of how to make a chocolate bar. And it explodes. It goes crazy. Chocolate remains today the most popular sweet snack in the world. So coming up with this, it actually really worked out. So you have your varieties of being a dark milk or a white. And very often, a question that comes up at the classes that we teach are, what are all of these percentages about? And the percentage can be confusing because isn't it like 100% chocolate? And the reality is it's kind of what percent of it is chocolate. So you have a dark, but you could have a dark that's 50%, or you could have a dark that's 72%. Those two darks could be completely different from each other. So what it's saying by 50% or 72% is the amount of actual cocoa bean product that's in there. So the rest of it could be made up of any amount of sugar or fat, and it just doesn't really matter. That fat might actually be from the cacao bean. It often is not. So if you bite into a chocolate bar and you have sort of that waxy sensation, it's because they're replacing the cocoa butter. And the reason why you'd replace the cocoa butter is because the price of chocolate, the most expensive part of the entire bean is actually not the proteins or the flavor containing part, it's the butter. And it's because the fat of the cacao plant is the only naturally occurring fat, or the closest naturally occurring fat, to having a melting point at the point of body temperature. And that's really important because it makes it so valuable for cosmetics. Not only lotions and things that we see advertised to have cocoa butter in them all the time, but also lipstick and makeup and things that are actually dramatically more expensive than the cocoa bar. So the commodity market of chocolate for cocoa butter is actually not commanded by the chocolate industry. It's commanded by the cosmetics industry. And so what the chocolate companies do in reaction to that is that they just don't use the cocoa butter. They use a cheaper alternative, or something that melts close to body temperature, but not quite. And the problem is, for them, that people are smart, and you can tell. You just know when it's not quite the right thing. So in dark chocolate, all you have is the cocoa solids, and then you have sugar, and then you have fat, and that's it. And I'm going to pass around some dark chocolate for you now. I'm giving you guys some culinary tweezers, and please tweeze them out because I'm afraid of everything that's going on in Europe. So don't get each other sick. So go ahead and tweeze it out, and you can put it in your own hand. We'll go over some things that you should be experiencing with this now. Theoretically, we should be starting with white chocolate and working backwards, but we're not, and it's for a reason. So you aren't doing a chocolate tasting, you're having a lecture today. So with dark chocolate, all you have is the sugar and the fat and the solids. With milk chocolate, you can add more into it. So we're adding in dry milk powder. In our case, our dairy co-op is up in the Andes. It's all grass-fed milk. That contributes a significant amount of flavor. In other ways, in some milk chocolates, though, it's not contributing a ton of flavor. Sometimes it'll just be a little tiny bit of milk just to take off a hint of something else that's going on with the beans. People who are making chocolate as actual chocolate makers are really concerned about balancing flavor. And so a chocolate might go into a grinder or into a conch, which is helping to develop the flavor. And it might sit there and rotate and rotate and rotate, and they might taste it after 12, 24 hours and say, oh, this chocolate can't be a dark chocolate. It's just not going to work. We have to add something else to it. It's just not quite right the way it is. So oftentimes it can be a very, very dark milk bar, or it can be a very, very light milk bar. So you'll see that on percentages. Like you can have a 32% milk chocolate bar because it's just totally packed with milk and sugar. Which for me, I like a really light milk chocolate bar. That sounds delicious. You can also, I mean, technically you could have like a 98% milk chocolate bar, and it would just, that little bit of milk qualifies it as still being a milk chocolate bar. And then there's white chocolate. So while we're passing around the milk chocolate, you can taste there's 2 different milk chocolates in here. They're both from Valrhona. We work with Valrhona on a sourcing project that we're really excited about, to try to source from almost entirely female or non-binary owned farms, which would be pretty cool. But there's 2 different milk chocolates in here. One is extraordinarily milky, and actually the milk has been caramelized before it was ever even put into the process. The other one's a little bit darker, but just like a classic milk chocolate. I wouldn't even consider it a dark milk chocolate, but next to the other one it would taste much darker. So while you're eating these ones, I want you to pay attention. When you're eating chocolate, and like I said, it's not a chocolate tasting, but you should just know what you're talking about. What you're looking for is first, you'd want to give it a smell. And just, what does it smell like? Does it smell rancid? I mean, you should probably always be smelling your food. We were reminiscing about a great sensory lab I had to do in college where in the beginning of class, we all knew we had to put on a blindfold and smell some like 30-year-old preserved army food. You know, it's probably a good habit to observe your food. The horror story for her was always that somebody was eating what they thought was flavored potato chips and there was actually a dead mouse in the bag. I know. In chocolate, you're not going to come across that, I hope. But it's always a good idea to smell no matter what, but you also can learn a lot about what the thing is that you're going to eat. So you smell first. Look at it. Does it look like chocolate? What kind of, does it have, what if your chocolate was blue? Then that's pretty interesting, right? Like, let's look at it, let's smell it, let's do the obvious. Then you can put it in your mouth. Most people you'll see that are tasting chocolate will put it in their mouth, hold it kind of with the side of their teeth, and then snap it. And what they're looking for is temper, which is sort of the next thing that we'll talk about. They're just looking to see how that crystalline structure was able to set up. So you should be able to hear a snap in a good piece of chocolate. You can't always visibly see it because chocolate actually scratches chocolate. And so chocolate that would be in perfect temper would be totally shiny, except for that's been sitting in a bag and got shipped here from Ecuador. And so it's rubbed up against a lot of other things. So it's made it a little bit more dull, but you can still check with a good snap. Then let it sit in your mouth and melt, which is probably the best part. And see how it flows across your tongue. See what kind of flavors come out. And in any good flavor, whether it's the flavors we're creating for our bonbons or if it's just chocolate itself, you're looking for a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there should sort of be the initial wave of flavor that hits you, and then you get something in the middle that's kind of the bulk of the flavor or like what you really experience the most of, and then there's a lingering flavor that sits on your tongue. And I think that the thing that really resonates with any quality foods is the last part, is something where people can say, I can still taste it. Like it's still lingering, it's still there. So I always like when the end note is something that's really long and lasting. So as you eat your milk chocolate, we will get into white chocolate, because white chocolate's so complicated, and I feel like an international advocate for white chocolate. So I will stand on my podium and let's talk about it. White chocolate, it depends on your definition whether white chocolate is actually chocolate. This white chocolate, by my definition, is white chocolate. So the reason why white chocolate is oftentimes not white chocolate is because the primary ingredient in white chocolate needs to be fat. And the fat that we use, the cocoa butter, is so expensive that so often there's absolutely no cocoa product in the white chocolate at all. In the white chocolate, we aren't using any of the proteins at all. We're just using the fat and the sugar. And so we're using the fat and the sugar and adding milk in order to create something. But if you're skimping out on the fat because it's really too expensive, then are you making chocolate? Oh. So what I would say in terms of the debate of is white chocolate actually chocolate, is good white chocolate is actually chocolate. Like if it actually contains cacao butter, then yes, it counts. It is a chocolate product. In the United States, our laws about what counts as chocolate are pretty interesting. They're pretty lenient. So what you can label a package with and say is chocolate can contain all kinds of things that are not chocolate. Versus in Europe, and by European standards, it's pretty stringent and based on the definitions that we're talking about now. The only other things that you can find in chocolate is usually there's less than 1% of something like an emulsifier. Sometimes it's soy, sometimes it's sunflower seed lecithin, and sometimes you'll have people adding vanilla. People can get really into the vanilla argument where they say then it should be a vanilla flavored chocolate bar. I don't really mind if it has vanilla in it or not. I think that's, up to Chocolatier's interpretation. So as you taste this white chocolate, what you're going to taste is our dairy co-op that's up in the Andes with all of these grass-fed cows. Like this chocolate actually tastes, when we're tasting white chocolates and people are bringing us things that they'd like us to work with, whether it's a collaboration or if it's a chocolate that's new, that we have a potential to be able to work with these people, we always taste it on a scale that goes from ice cream to mayonnaise. If butter was in the middle, that's what we're looking for. So you have the ice creams of white chocolates, which are really too sweet and very vanilla-y, and absolutely use blue cheese as your example. It could not go with blue cheese. It just wouldn't work. And then you have the ones that are like mayonnaise, where they're like kind of tangy and a little funky, not too sweet. But could we put it with this strawberry? You're like, maybe not. The thing is, butter is like universal. Butter can go with anything. So what we're looking for is the butter of white chocolate. This one is from República del Cacao. It's absolutely delicious. And even if you don't like white chocolate, now that you've gone through your dark chocolate and your milk chocolate, you're obligated, you have to try it. And at least just give it a try, because it may be the only or first real white chocolate that you've ever actually eaten. More common than not, the white chocolate that is called white chocolate is not actually chocolate at all. But defend the real stuff, because it exists out there. And this stuff is actually chocolate. So you guys can go ahead and try that too. So you can see on here, actually, see how that milk chocolate bar kind of has some little like dots on it? These are not our chocolate bars. That one I just grabbed from the internet. That's actually called Bloom. That's kind of the next thing that we're going to move into. And then what's going on over here is that's a depositor that's making the little blobs that we're passing around right now. And those actually are some of the blobs that we use are coming out of that exact machine. So what's going on is after it's all ground, it's totally liquid, it's being stored in tanks, and then we need to temper it because we don't want that to happen. So tempering is the thing that keeps chocolatiers from being chocolatiers. It keeps the future away from chocolate. And so it's about this much science. It's not that much. Like you guys will be right on board with about what it takes, but it's enough that it's scary to other people. It's scarier than making hollandaise sauce, and so it keeps people away from participating at home. And so tempering is the process of manipulating the temperature the same way you would do with glass in order to have tempered glass. Tempered glass is stronger than regular glass. Tempered chocolate is also stronger than regular chocolate and comes with some of the tempered chocolate creates sort of some of the sensory factors that we really, really appreciate about chocolate, both working with it and eating it. So on the right, you see that's just a 6-quart Cambro at our manufactory a couple weeks ago of completely untempered chocolate. And it looks like it's from outer space. And there's many versions of what untempered looks like. And I actually, usually we have a great example. We have an okay example from our manufactory in here. This was in a piping bag and left over, so you can see, don't open it up, don't eat it, you can just look at it. But what you'll see on it is you'll see some cloudiness, and you'll see where it sort of looks like velvety instead of smooth, whereas other areas of it do look smooth. And then there's some speckling, like what showed up in the chocolate bar that was over on this side. And that's bloom. And there's multiple different kinds of bloom. So you can have sugar bloom or you can have fat bloom. There's 2 ways you can do it. And they'll appear in a lot of different ways. And it's really, I think it's unique to people who eat chocolate in Michigan or in Ohio or anywhere around the Great Lakes, in that bloom very often looks like a Petoskey stone, like almost exact. And it's one of those things that's difficult to explain to people, but it'll start with little Petoskey stone looking things. And if you're seeing that, then you know that there's bigger problems like this coming up. So what happens is that if you just take melted chocolate and then you put it out onto a tray and then you let it cool at room temperature, it's not going to ever really get hard. You might get something where it tastes kind of sandy or grainy. You might get something where it never hardens at all and it always just stays sort of pliable and touchable. But by manipulating the temperature, we are able to create 6 different structures. There's one that's kind of acceptable and one that's perfect. And so what we do is we have to take all of the chocolate to the point where it's over 120 degrees. And that's the hottest that it will ever have to get. We aren't dealing with, in a lot of candy kitchens, there's also somebody working with sugar work, and they're working with stuff that is extraordinarily hot. The chocolatiers kind of get off easy because most of our stuff never gets too hot. So we take it up over 120 degrees, where absolutely no crystal can form at all. Nothing can happen at that phase. So we're basically knocking any crystalline formation that has already happened in the chocolate completely out, so it doesn't exist anymore. Then what we do is we take it down just to the point where it really wants to create crystals, where it's like really, really happy to do it. And there's a couple different things we can do at that point. We can either manipulate the temperatures there to take it to certain crystalline growth stages while it's constantly moving, or you can keep it moving in a bowl and you can just add chocolate that is perfectly tempered and it'll sort of infect the rest of it. Like it all wants to come into temper. If you've ever done that experiment with ice where like the water is so cold and it wants to be ice and as soon as you put like one snowflake in it, the whole thing just crystallizes over. It's the same sort of situation where the chocolate is in the temperature zone where it wants to crystallize and you keep mixing it and mixing it and mixing it and you put some of those crystals in there and it is like right on board with it. So the next thing that we do, once it does have all of these active growing crystals in it, it will grow some of the ones that we don't want to. And so what we do is we take it back up, not to the point where it gets rid of all of the crystals, but to the point where some of the bad crystals will be uncomfortable again. So it's kind of like a fever, I guess, where like your fever can go up and it can try to kill off some stuff that's going on. Like we're kind of trying to kill off some crystals that might be happening by taking the temperature back up before we take it back down to a working temperature. And a working temperature can vary depending on the kind of chocolate. So white chocolate's going to have the lowest working temperature, maybe somewhere in between 85 and 87 degrees. And you'll have milk chocolate, which goes, really you could be at 86 to maybe 89, might be high degrees. And then dark chocolate, which you can go pretty much from 86, 87, and then up to maybe 90, 91, but that would also be pushing it. So you have 3 different working temperatures. The reason why you have different working temperatures is because there are different things in there also. We have to remember that cocoa butter that we're tempering is not the only thing that's in it. And so we have to pay attention to the amount of fat and the amount of sugar that's also in there. So on the right, you can see when chocolate is perfectly in temper. And I brought you guys it's a Bonceratops. And it's not totally finished, so you can even see this is like an unfinished factory project. And it got put in the reject bin, which usually gets melted, so I don't know what's wrong with it. And maybe you guys will find it. But it didn't get cleaned up, but you can kind of see a work in process Bonceratops. And you can see it's like this, like the eggplant. It's shiny, and I can hold it, and it's not melting in my hand. Oftentimes, you'll see chocolate bars, even from the gas station, they have sort of like a film on top, or they look a little bit cloudy, and that's also untempered. So you could have a perfectly tempered chocolate, and then, in our case, ship it to somebody in California, and in their case, receive it at maybe CVS or at a grocery store. And if it sits in the sun for a little while, all of your hard work is either destroyed because of melting, or if it is salvageable, the next day you'll see that cloud on it. It's not mold, it's not bad for you, you can eat it, I eat it every day. It's not a problem at all. It's just that the fat and sugar are leaching out of the crystalline structure of the chocolate. When it is in temper, it gives you that great snap, and it's shiny, and for us, it's so nice because it's so easy to work with. Chocolate has this amazing property where, oh, I went too far. Chocolate has this amazing property where it will actually contract. So when we're molding it, and these are the molds that we use, we're actually filling it up the same way that you would fill up an ice cube tray. And then you'll scrape all the excess off of the top, and then you dump it over like this picture over here. So you turn the whole thing over, and what happens that's different than ice or water is that the chocolate is sticky. And so it sticks to the outside of the mold, and what's left in the mold actually becomes the chocolate shell in which we make a bonbon. So it coats the outside, we scrape off the excess, and then we turn it back upside down. The machine you see there is a chocolate tempering machine, and those boys are actually both playing Charlie in the national tour of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is pretty cool. And Borna's making shells with them, but you can see that stack behind Borna you can see how the insides of those molds are just totally coated. And we let them sit, and chocolate, opposite from water, will contract from the mold. Whereas if you put water in there, it will expand and you have to go like kind of crack to get them out. Untempered chocolate will do absolutely nothing in that mold. And so what happens is you just have a mold covered in sticky stuff. So the temper of the chocolate is something that's always extraordinarily important and completely dictates the entire pace of our operation. If the chocolate is in temper, no one is available for anything. So we always have a designated person that has to deal with customers, and customers actually do have to wait if we're in the middle of chocolate and it gets too busy. So once the chocolate is in temper, it can release from the mold. The same property of chocolate that does allow it to contract means that if you put it on the outside of something, it'll actually hold it together. So you can't, like sometimes you'll see chocolate that's molded around a balloon, like you can take a balloon and dip it into tempered chocolate, and then that will cool, and you can just pop the balloon because the balloon will then contract. But we can also use that to our advantage for things around the shop, mostly just decorative things, but we'll actually use this capacity of chocolate to shrink upon itself to fix things or make things or hold things together. Because once it is, tempered chocolate is pretty strong, so once it is in temper, we can actually hold it there, barring that there is no heat, for quite some time. For example, this mug has been on display in our office for 4 years, and it's only held together by chocolate. So beyond the chocolate, by the time that we've made the chocolate shells, we have to make a lot of different fillings. We don't have to. This is the most fun part. So we make a lot of them. We could go into all of them. We could have a complex discussion about caramels, but we'll just talk about ganache. So chocolate ganache is a very clear chocolate definition, kind of like truffle. A ganache is chocolate mixed with a fat. And so it could be any fat. Usually it'll be dairy. Generally it'll be heavy cream. But it also could be animal fat. You could make a ganache with tallow. It could be a vegetable fat. You could use coconut oil. You could use olive oil. As long as it's chocolate plus fat, then you have a ganache going on. The only exception to that rule is a gianduja. And gianduja is spelled Gianduja. And I always say that because so many people have seen the word before but never knew how to say it. Our hazelnut piece, our hazelnut gianduja piece, hazelnut gianduja is the most common gianduja, like Nutella. It's actually called hazel what, just because nobody can say gianduja, and so often it doesn't get ordered in a chocolate shop because people are afraid of it. A gianduja is just a nut butter with chocolate, so it's still a fat. It's still something that contains fat. Like if you just did peanut oil in chocolate, then you would have a peanut oil ganache. If you did peanut butter and chocolate, then you have a peanut gianduja. So you can do giandujas a lot of ways. It doesn't have to be hazelnuts and milk chocolate, even though that's the most popular one. Walnuts and dark chocolate is really popular. We make one with pistachios and white chocolate. That's my favorite thing that we make, I think. It's absolutely delicious. But we won't talk about giandujas anymore, just ganaches. So a ganache has, let's say just a very classic ganache has heavy cream. You're putting chocolate in it, which is also contributing some fat, contributing the sugar. You may add some additional sugar to it. Oftentimes, the sugar is being added for shelf life rather than for flavor. So you might add some glucose. Glucose is a favorite because oftentimes the chocolate's already pretty sugary enough, and glucose to the taste buds isn't that sweet. And so it also has a really frustrating texture to it in that it's really kind of oozy. So it can kind of glob on itself, and it gives you that mouth feel when you bite into something like a bonbon where you can see your teeth marks into it at first, and then your teeth marks sort of go away after a while. So it really depends, like that chocolate piece that I ate in the Netherlands 100 years ago, it depends on the experience that you want that person to have. And that's what we're constantly thinking through is, what is the experience that we want you to have? One thing that we're always talking about is we don't want you to break a tooth. So nothing hard is ever hidden. And you'll see a lot of times chocolatiers are giving you an idea of what they're making by putting like forking marks on top. So you'll see it has a certain drizzle and it tells you what flavor it is, or in our case, we just label it. But even when you look at it, we try to do you a favor of saying, this looks like it might be spicy. Or this looks like it might be, insert something here. There might be something crunchy in here, to give people the idea before they just go ahead and try to use their front teeth in order to kind of get right through it. So as we're creating ganaches and we're creating the recipes that we want to use, we're really considering what is the experience that we want somebody to have with this specific bonbon. And there might not be just one ganache in that bonbon. More often we have 2 or 3 ganaches and maybe 2 or 3 toppings that are on top of it as well. So we're thinking about this in the context of like, maybe we don't let this one, maybe we don't add any sugar or glucose or fructose or any additional sugar at all to the ganache that we're making, because maybe we know we're putting it with a confiture, which is a candied fruit that is very, very sweet. And so we want that contrast between the flavors. So what else we might add to a ganache is kind of up in the air, but the basic is we're adding heavy cream to chocolate. And the challenge with this part is less technical, except for that we're still creating an emulsion. And emulsions are still scary. I.e. hollandaise sauce or salad dressings. In salad dressing, you can always reshake it, but if we don't make a correct emulsion using the chocolate, and then we pipe it into a shell, and then it makes it to Ohio, you're going to have this separation occur that's going to be not only ugly, but also oozy, and we can't have that situation happening. So what you can see happening here is the chocolate and the heavy cream are starting to come together. So we'll have molten chocolate in let's say a bowl, and you have molten chocolate on the bottom. And you'll take scalded heavy cream, so not boiling heavy cream, but heavy cream that sort of has the steam coming off of it and it's steaming up the outside of the bowl. And it might actually have like a small layer of stuff that looks like you put a layer of saran wrap on some milk. And that's a good layer, not a bad layer. It's just some cooling fat. And we like fat. Fat is our friend for chocolate. We're making deliciously textured things. And so once it has that, we can pour it on top of the chocolate, and then we let them sit and wait, and we let them just hang out together. And the way I always try to think of this is, when I was little, we had a fish tank, and we went to the fair, and my sister won a fish. And we got back, and then my dad took the bag and put it in the fish tank and let it sit until the bag and the fish water were the same temperature, so it didn't shock the fish. And so when I'm training people, I always explain, don't shock the fish. Like, by letting them come sort of to the same temperature so that they're comfortable with each other, we're taking 2 things. We're taking something that has water in it, and we're taking something that's it has almost no water in it and is mostly fat-based, and we're trying to get them to come together. And so by making as many circumstances around them as possible the same, i.e. their temperature, they're more and more likely to be able to want to come together and create something that will be a stable emulsion. As it cools, the nice thing about it is the fat will be able to hold all of that water, but it also helps, fat and sugar are primary preservatives. And other chocolates, our chocolates only last about, depending on the piece, between usually about 3 weeks. We have some pieces that are hard pieces and last longer, up to like 6 months. But most chocolates will last up to a year. And most chocolates that are bonbons, like what we make, and you have to wonder what else are they putting in it in order to make it last for a year. And our focus is always flavor. So we have just chosen not to be a wholesale company because we are choosing not to use additional preservatives. But it would be very, very easy, I could say, from a business sense, to want to do that in order to have the shelf life that people need in order to sell in other places, like maybe Target or a fancy food shop somewhere. So for that reason, we only sell from our own stores. On the right, you can see us infusing a chocolate with something. So we can do different things. We can add additives to it. We can infuse it with a flavor, which means basically like making a tea infusion. This one's made with Lady Grey tea and heavy cream. So we can let it sit with the cream for sometimes an hour, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes overnight, depending on the flavor that we're trying to capture from it. And then we can use that heavy cream in order to flavor the ganache. You can also add flavor directly to the ganache. This is more common in modern chocolate making, but we kind of take a unique approach on that. So I brought a ganache that we made yesterday for leap year. We made a bon called Leap and Lizards, and it's just bananas Foster flavored. It's a white chocolate ganache, but we were able to make a stable banana and brown sugar caramel, essentially, that was added to it. So the nice thing about it is, yes, we do use fresh bananas. We don't use fake banana flavoring. So we're able to get this really, really sincere flavor. However, we've been able to add a shelf life to it that can get us to a 3-week best by date, only by using naturally occurring things like sugar and fat that also contribute to the flavor, rather than just adding sugar in order to make it have a longer shelf life. So same thing, please use these sticks, and you can just, we call these tasting sticks. You might recognize them as craft sticks or tongue depressors, but you can just scrape off a little bit like this and try some ganache. Another white chocolate ganache to try to convert you all. So we can use the ganaches and we can use the fillings, and then we can add different toppings in order to create all kinds of just wild different creations for our customers. So 5 times a year, we're coming out with a complete 12 to 14-piece box that people can try and experience. And we have customers that have had every single collection that we've made since we've opened. So it's pretty wild, but we can also do, once you get over that hump of science, whether it's the tempering science or if it's the emulsion science that's kind of scary, the rest is all art. And to me, I like both. I'm really interested in the science part. Like I said, like any section of that, like fermentation, I have to control myself on because I just think it's such an interesting frontier in chocolate. But any section of it can get so interesting, but you can get carried away just as easily with the way that you're decorating it. So for us, everything is open-faced, so you can see what you're eating. We don't, they call it bottoming, but it's just adding a seal on it, and we actually make the bottom the top, so it's a little confusing. But we don't seal it. We actually seal it with the same thing that's on the outside of M&Ms, which is candy shellac, which is also from bugs. Not quite like honey, but similar. So we actually seal it with candy shellac on the top in order to create, it's kind of like a can would, in order to create an environment where nothing's getting in or out. And then we can top it with a wide variety of different things that we also make. And this is where the options are endless. Once you've been able to get through all of the science, it's kind of totally up to you. So a lot of times, this is the part that people become attracted to working at Bon 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 for. But the reality is, the people that stay the longest and fall the deepest in love with it are the people that are really, really interested and have become insane experts on the more technical aspects of it. And I put on because I think the most important chemistry of all, and it's corny, but it's so true, is that there's just really real chemistry in a business between all of the people and between the product, and it's just something that is a very mutually beneficial thing to everybody who's there. So one thing that I would say is the most incredible kind of chemistry, and the thing that I think we're all the most grateful for, is just the chemistry of our team, but even our community, which of course extends all the way out here, to be able to come and do things like this and let people know to come on in, and not to make it so Willy Wonka-fied that you're, you know, what's behind the factory doors, but actually just experience it and see it and get a taste of it, and then get sucked down a chocolate hole with us and hang out in the black hole and chill. And so it's an incredible team of people that make all of the chocolate that we make. And before I take any questions, which I have bonbons for the first, I think, 10 questions, I just want to say, if you ever do have questions, or if you do have research, personal or professional, in an area that is about chocolate and you would want to get in more depth, or if you just have chocolate questions in general about something like, hey, I heard Bon 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 has a really rad chocolate brownie recipe for all the scrap chocolate that they have, which we do, you're welcome to email us, and it's bonbonbon@bonbonbon.com. And believe me, it's always a relief to get an email from somebody from a lecture or from a class or from a workshop or a customer, amongst the number of people that are trying to sell us SEO optimization. So please email. You're always welcome. It's a thrill to hear from you guys and something that you're interested in. So never be afraid to reach out. It's an easy one to remember, bonbonbon@bonbonbon.com. So with no further ado, any questions? You guys first. You've been so good.
Knowledge Stream is made possible by a generous gift provided by the Appold Family Charitable Fund.